The desert looked alive at twilight, every dune breathing light, exhaling shadow. The horizon burned copper and violet, a molten divide between day and night that seemed to shift with every step. Sand rolled in soft waves under Megan's boots, whispering like silk against stone. Her glove brushed her rifle stock, torn, frayed at the fingertips, leaving faint smears of dust that caught the fading sun. The weapon gleamed briefly, then dulled as the light bent away. Her team moved in a staggered line. 6 dark figures stretched thin across the ridgeline. Their shapes rose and fell with the terrain, merging with the dunes until they seemed part of the landscape itself. No one spoke. The comms crackled only once every few minutes, brief codes exchanged in static whispers. She could feel their breathing more than she could hear it, the disciplined rhythm of men and women trained to disappear inside noise. Heat still rose from the ground in wavering sheets, bending the horizon into a mirage of motion. What was real shimmered like a memory. What was illusion held still. The light refracted off her goggles, turning the world into fragments of gold and shadow. Every ridge felt closer than it was, every hollow deeper. The desert toyed with perception, demanding that they trust discipline more than sight. Megan paused at the crest of a dune. Hand raised. Her silhouette broke the horizon, a single shape cut against the sun. Below her, the landscape unfolded in shallow waves, glittering faintly with quartz and dust. Somewhere beyond those ridges lay the downed ISR drone, its encrypted core carrying weeks of reconnaissance data, and its beacon gone silent. The mission was simple: recover, extract, erase, all trace. But simplicity was the first lie every operation told. She knelt and scanned the ridgelines through her scope. Mirage shimmer blurred everything into watercolor movement. The dunes rippled in subtle rhythm, the wind dragging tendrils of dust across their spines. No tracks, no heat, nothing alive. And yet, the silence felt shaped, too complete, as though the desert itself was listening. Her gloved fingers brushed the sand. It was still warm from the day, grains clinging like static. She pressed deeper, feeling the faint tremor of wind pushing through the layers beneath. There was no stability here, only patience. A single breath, too loud, could draw attention. A misstep could crumble an hour's worth of silence. She inhaled slowly, the filtered air dry against her throat. 2 clicks to the beacon, whispered Ortiz. Rear security. The sound barely registered. She nodded, knowing he'd see the motion through his NV overlay. The team moved again, slow, even steps, spacing deliberate. Each operator tracked the shadow of the one ahead, keeping distance exact, never breaking the pattern. The sun lowered another inch. Shadows grew long and liquid, stretching across dunes like spilled ink. Megan's braid caught the last edge of gold, a brief streak of color before fading into the same tan and gray as her Marpat uniform. The wind shifted direction, cooler now, sliding across the ridges with a sigh that felt almost human. Time here was measured in light, not minutes. The collapsing sun was their hourglass, its descent dictating the margin between control and exposure. She could feel it fading behind her like a pulse slowing toward silence. The desert thrived on that collapse. It lived in the space between visibility and blindness. At the next halt, she crouched beside a slope of crumbling sand, pulling her map from the admin pouch. The digital readout flickered, briefly losing satellite lock. She tapped it twice with a knuckle and watched the coordinates stabilize. The downed drone signal had gone cold hours ago, but the terrain lines matched the last telemetry burst, a dry basin surrounded by crescent dunes, an easy approach for an ambush. She folded the map, slid it back into the pouch, and touched her comms switch. Echo 1, hold overwatch. Echo 2, left flank, 30 meters off. We're staying under shadow. Her voice came out calm, the practiced stillness of someone who's learned that fear wastes oxygen. As they descended into the basin, the air cooled further. Each footfall pressed soundless impressions into the sand, vanishing almost immediately under the sliding dust. The only constant was the weight of her rifle, the rasp of grit against metal, and the dry taste of adrenaline turning sweet in the back of her throat. Megan's awareness sharpened into layers terrain. Light, angles, silence. Every dune was a potential threat. Every hollow, a potential refuge. She knew the desert's cruelty wasn't in heat or distance, but in how it made everything equal. Life and death indistinguishable until too late. The team halted again as the last rim of sunlight broke apart on the horizon. The desert lost its color all at once, turning into gradients of gray and shadow. Megan's heart rate stayed steady, trained rhythm overriding instinct. She adjusted her rifle strap, glanced down at her gloves, the right palm torn open where rope friction had burned through earlier missions, skin scabbed beneath, endurance written in fabric and blood. She thought of how silence could feel heavier than noise, how control wasn't something you held, but something you balanced like a blade's edge. Every operation demanded belief in that balance, that awareness and timing could outlast chaos. The dunes whispered around her, erasing the team's passage even before they finished moving. And then, on the far edge of the horizon, a faint light flickered. Once, twice. Pause. Once more. A rhythmic pulse, perfectly spaced, too deliberate to be chance, too faint to trust. She froze, lowering her scope to confirm. The shimmer twisted through the heat haze, blurring into a ghost of reflection. Could be a signal mirror, could be sunlight catching broken glass, or could be something waiting for them to step closer. Eyes on flash. Grid 07. Her voice dropped into a whisper. Hold position. Her pulse slowed even further. Not panic, but calculation. Light, distance, angle. The flash had come from a ridge facing west, directly into the dying sun. Perfect direction for a lure. She studied it again through the scope, and for an instant, it vanished, swallowed by shadow as the last of the light slipped beneath the dunes. When she looked up again, the desert had gone still. The air carried no sound but their own breathing. Megan brushed her gloved hand over her rifle, clearing a layer of sand from the receiver. The metal was warm, then cooling, like the desert itself, exhaling into darkness. Above her, the sky deepened into violet, the first stars flickering through the haze. She felt the desert watching back, impersonal, endless, waiting to see who would move first. The Mirage had become mirror, every reflection a question of trust. Mark it, she said quietly. We move at last light. The sun bled completely away, leaving her and her team suspended between clarity and shadow, their silhouettes etched against the horizon, a line of discipline moving through the illusion of safety. The horizon broke apart in shimmer and smoke. From the top of the ridge, Megan saw what looked like safety, a small flare of reflected light, steady, rhythmic, the kind of pulse a seal beacon might throw in low sun. The world had gone hushed since the last transmission, the team walking in silence except for the faint hiss of wind dragging dust along their sleeves. Heat haze bent the dunes into mirage waves, each ridge folding over the next until distance ceased to mean anything. Visual on signal, Ortiz murmured through the headset, voice like dry static. Megan raised a gloved hand, halting the team. Sand spilled from the torn seam at her wrist as she knelt, lowering her rifle scope toward the flicker. Through glass, the shimmer fractured into 3 separate glints, too irregular for mirror flashes, too still for movement. Her instinct pressed cold against her ribs. The light wasn't calling them in. It was waiting for them to arrive. Hold, she said, low and calm. No movement. The team froze across the slope. 6 silhouettes melted into shadow, forming a crescent of their own without needing a word. The desert hummed, a soundless vibration more felt than heard. She adjusted the scope, focusing through the distortion. Mirage shimmer twisted the far ridgeline until it resembled a ghost of its own reflection. For one heartbeat, she thought she saw figures, but they wavered, blurred, vanished. The radio hissed softly, long and unnatural, as though the air itself were listening. Then, Mirage blinked. The first burst of gunfire arrived as a whisper, suppressed, precise, like fabric tearing through air. Sand leapt around her boots, small geysers of dust spraying in arcs. The sound never reached full volume. The desert devoured it instantly. Contact. Northwest ridge. Megan's glove went up again, trailing sand. Her body moved before thought. Angles. Distance. Timing running through her like reflex mathematics. She rolled to the right, found partial cover behind a sloped ridge, and pressed her cheek to the dust. Through the scope, she saw nothing but haze. Shadows darted where no one stood. Return fire. Controlled pairs, she said. Use glare. Her team's response was near silent, flashes barely visible, brass immediately swallowed by sand. The desert turned the firefight into a hallucination. Each muzzle burst was a ghost of light that flickered, faded, and vanished into mirage shimmer. The world shrank to movement and geometry. The ridge to their north, higher ground, firing angle of 30 degrees, wind out of the west, carrying their muzzle heat downrange. Setting sun, low, glare flowing into the attacker's sightlines. She could see it now, the faint curvature of muzzle flashes forming a crescent around them, a classic ambush shape, overlapping fields of fire, but too wide, too greedy. They'd left an open mouth toward the light. Her breathing slowed. She felt the torn leather in her gloves pull tight as she shifted her grip. Every heartbeat measured the distance between understanding and chaos. Echo 1. Suppress ridge east. 2. Break right. Use shadow line. 3. You're with me. The air turned liquid with heat and dust. Tracers hissed through mirage shimmer, curving like sparks underwater. Her boot dug into the dune, sand cascading down the slope in a muffled roar. She moved fast, sliding to a depression between two ridges. The sun was lower now, half buried behind the dunes, its light refracting like broken glass. The world alternated between blindness and perfect vision. Ortiz crawled beside her, his voice barely audible through the static. We're boxed. West, north, northeast. Not boxed, Megan murmured. They drew it too wide. Her eyes tracked the curvature of fire, plotting it like a map, each flash lined along the natural sweep of the dunes. The enemy had mimicked the desert's own geometry without realizing how it betrayed them. Their formation bent inward, but the sun burned across its edge. The same glare that blinded her scope now blinded theirs. Use it, she said. Shift toward the light. The team moved, measured, deliberate. No panic, no wasted words. They slipped sideways, firing in short controlled bursts, invisible behind the glare. Muzzle flashes flickered in waves across the horizon, but they were distorted, unanchored, each one reflecting in multiple places. The battlefield had become a hall of mirrors. Megan's world tightened to the sensation of sand under her knees, the metallic tang of heat through her helmet's filter, the click of the bolt catching home. Her rifle moved with precision born from repetition, each motion identical to the 1,000 that came before. A round struck close, the sand spraying against her cheek like rain. She didn't flinch. The mirage wavered again, revealing silhouettes half buried in shadow. They fired wildly, guided by illusion, their tracers carving shallow arcs that missed by meters. Steady, she whispered. Her tone wasn't command but rhythm, a low anchor against chaos. The seals adjusted, firing in sequence. Each shot came like a heartbeat, quiet, certain. The desert seemed to pause between them, absorbing the sound before returning it as wind. For a moment, she caught the symmetry, the dunes curving like waves, the ambush echoing their shape, light collapsing into shadow in perfect alignment. She could almost feel the pattern turning over, the trap folding in on itself. The radio clicked once, a faint acknowledgement from Ortiz. No need for words. The geometry had spoken for them. Megan raised her rifle, sighting through the blur. The heat distorted everything. Distance, form, even color. But her mind corrected automatically. She exhaled, let the reticle settle, and squeezed. The figure in the shimmer folded as if erased. No sound, only dust. Adjust flank. On me. They pushed forward a few meters at a time, shifting the engagement's axis. The attackers' formation began to unravel, their arcs of fire crossing each other as they tried to compensate for vanishing targets. Confusion bred hesitation. Megan used it. Each dune they moved behind became a barrier of silence. The only constant was the rhythm of breathing, calm, metered, and the whisper of sand sliding under their boots. Every shot now came from shadow. The sun was almost gone, its last light cutting horizontally across the basin, painting everything in liquid amber. Her glove brushed the sand as she halted. Torn seams, embedded dust, the fabric dark with sweat. It was control made fragile, the balance between precision and decay. She looked down the slope where her team's shadows stretched long and thin, intersecting with those of their enemies. Crescent to circle, she murmured, half to herself. They're standing in their own perimeter. That was the shape of it, the geometry inverted. The desert had drawn its map, and she had only to follow its lines backward. She toggled her comms, voice steady though her pulse thundered. All stations. Perimeter clear. Prepare to fold the line. The static hummed, soft, anticipatory, like breath before a shot. She watched the horizon one last time. The mirage shimmered faintly, light and shadow trembling on the edge of night. In that unstable moment, everything seemed balanced. Order against chaos, discipline against fear, sand against sky. Her hand tightened on the rifle grip. The sun vanished. On my mark, she whispered. We fold the line. Her shadow stretched into the dark, and the world tipped into silence. The light was dying fast, spilling across the dunes like liquid metal. The sun's last line hovered just above the horizon, bleeding through a veil of dust that made the desert shimmer as if submerged. Every shadow stretched into infinity, and every silhouette seemed to dissolve before it could be aimed upon. Megan moved through it like she'd rehearsed this terrain for years. One motion for every breath, one breath for every decision. Her team followed without words, each operator a fraction of her rhythm. The enemy still fired, but their shots went wide, blinded by the glare pouring from the west. The ridge became a wall of light, their scopes useless. The battlefield belonged to those who could see geometry through blindness, and Megan could. She saw it in lines of sight, in curving angles of sand, in the flicker of muzzle flashes reflecting off airborne grit. She crouched low, the slope warm beneath her knees. Sand lifted in soft veils, carried by a wind that smelled faintly of copper and ozone. The moment her glove touched the ground, the torn seam reopened, a sting of pain, a line of blood mixing with dust. She didn't flinch. The torn gloves were just another map of endurance, a record written in motion. Her rifle pressed against her shoulder, steady, familiar, the steel cool despite the air's lingering heat. Shift west. 25 meters. She whispered into comms. Her voice barely carried. We use the drop. A faint double click answered. The team began sliding along the contour of the ridge, boots carving thin trenches into sand. The world became a shifting blur, wind and light fusing together, sound folding into itself. Gunfire pulsed like distant thunder, never quite reaching its echo. Megan crawled forward through grit and shadow. The sand scratched against her armor, filling every seam, grinding into the plates of her carrier. Her braid caught wind, whipping against her neck, stinging like wire. Each inhale rasped through her comms mic, mechanical and measured. She lifted her head just enough to scan the slope ahead, enemy shapes flickering in and out of mirage distortion. It was like fighting through a dream that refused to hold still. A suppressed shot cracked beside her, Ortiz's rifle burping in two precise bursts. Dust erupted where the rounds hit. Then, Stillness. A faint body-shaped distortion collapsed. No scream, no sound, only the sigh of settling sand. The brass casings vanished instantly into the ground, as if the desert refused evidence. "Megan," Ortiz's voice rasped. "They're realigning. Flank moving north." "Good," she replied. "Let them curve." She rose to a crouch, her form a dark cutout against the golden wash. Her movements were methodical. Aim, fire, pivot, move, each one designed to feed chaos back into the trap. The light was their ally now. A blade she wielded without waste. Muzzle flashes shimmered in the mirage, ghosts appearing and dissolving faster than thought. The desert turned war into reflection. Wind swept harder across the basin, dragging lines of sand that looked like smoke trails. The ridgeline began to blur entirely, outlines melting into haze. For a heartbeat, Megan couldn't tell whether the figures she saw were hers or theirs, motion without identity, flickers without depth. But her body knew the rhythm. Her instinct could tell friend from illusion. That was the secret of discipline when thought collapsed. The pattern remained. A burst of enemy fire cut through the air, muffled like cloth tearing. Bullets hissed overhead, striking the ridge behind them in soft thuds. She pressed her cheek into the dirt, exhaled slowly, and crawled up the next incline. Sand clung to her gloves, the torn fabric darkening with sweat and blood. Each motion became smaller, quieter, as if she were learning to move through time itself. Then she saw it. The curve, complete. The attackers' formation bent inward, their fire intersecting in the basin where her team no longer was. They had formed their own circle, unknowing, their lines collapsing under the geometry she'd drawn from the desert itself. Now, she breathed. The seals shifted position in unison, as if guided by unseen gravity. They opened fire from two flanks, their shots faint, clean, synchronized. Every burst followed the beat of her pulse. Muzzle flashes lit the air like short-lived constellations, and then were gone. From the enemy's perspective, it must have seemed like the desert itself was firing. Soundless, shapeless, light-devouring form. Their return fire faltered, one by one. Their silhouettes vanished in the glare. Megan rose again, her profile a ghost in the burning haze. She stepped forward slowly, rifle braced, scanning each ridge for motion. Around her, sand swirled in spirals, miniature storms catching the dying sunlight. The wind grew fierce, pulling grit into the air until visibility shrank to a few meters. The storm was coming, birthed by the heat's collapse. She pulled her shema up over her mouth and advanced through the storm's front edge. The sound inside it was strange, half silence, half whisper. The world stripped of definition. Brass rolled across the sand at her boots, vanishing moments later. She saw a rifle half buried, a hand protruding, then gone as the wind took it. The battle was over, but the movement wasn't. Combat didn't stop when the noise stopped. It lingered, humming inside muscle and bone. Her breathing stayed slow, each inhale metered through training. She looked toward the horizon, what little remained of it, now swallowed by dust. The sun was finally sinking, no longer blinding, now just a dull ember fading beneath the storm. In that dim light, the world looked almost suspended, caught between ending and memory. She knelt in the sand, the motion, deliberate. The ground was still warm beneath her glove, her fingers pressed down, feeling vibration through the earth. Wind, maybe, or the last footsteps of the enemy retreating into illusion. Her blood, darkened by grit, spread faintly through the torn leather. Her voice barely carried, more a breath than sound. "Discipline holds," she whispered. "Chaos breaks." For a long moment, she stayed there, rifle across her knees, the storm bending around her silhouette. The dunes moved like slow water, reshaping themselves even as she watched. Above her, the light fractured for the last time, the color draining out of the world until only shades of gray remained. The battle, suspended in that, in between, dissolved into silence. And as night finally took hold, the desert became what it always was: endless, indifferent, and perfectly still. The silence afterward felt almost sacred. Wind drifted low across the dunes, brushing away the last traces of motion, smoothing every footprint as if the fight had never existed. Brass lay half buried where men had fallen, their glint already fading beneath the shifting sand. The sky had lost its fire, color draining into gray, horizon dissolving into haze. The battle's rhythm, once sharp and mathematical, had gone still, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like pressure on the lungs. Megan stood in that quiet and let her breathing settle. Her rifle hung low, barrel down, the metal dusted with grit and sweat. She turned slowly, scanning the basin where chaos had lived an hour ago. There were no shapes now, no movement, just smooth dunes, faint ridgelines, and the suggestion of patterns erased. The desert was already rewriting what had happened. "Clear left," Ortiz murmured, his voice a whisper of exhaustion. "Clear," came the reply from somewhere beyond the ridge. Each seal's movement carried weight, not haste, but ritual. They stepped with precision, as though the act of clearing ground had become a kind of prayer. One bent to retrieve a dropped magazine, another brushed sand off a fallen radio. The sounds were small, Velcro tearing, metal scraping, boots grinding into soft earth. The wind carried it all away within seconds. Megan moved toward the burned-out truck half sunk at the basin's edge. The smell of metal and dust mixed with something faintly chemical. Gun oil, scorched rubber, the ghost of fuel. The vehicle's side panel was charred, the tires half melted into the sand. She crouched beside it, her shadow stretching long and thin across the cooling surface. The drone core sat wedged in the wreckage, a small, black box, corners dented, casing smeared with soot. She reached for it, careful not to disturb the sand more than necessary. The metal was warm to the touch, still holding the memory of fire. Her glove, torn at the palm, left a faint trace of red where she lifted it free. For a moment, she just looked at it, the weight of information it carried, the reason lives had been risked and lost. The device seemed fragile, almost insignificant against the immensity of the landscape. She slipped it into her pouch, sealing it with a slow, deliberate motion. Mission accomplished, but the words felt too blunt for what had been spent to achieve it. The temperature dropped quickly as the last of the light vanished. The dunes shifted color, turning from bronze to ashen blue, from ashen blue to silver gray. Even the stars above seemed dulled by dust. Heat bled from the ground into the air, leaving the sand cool beneath her knees. She placed a gloved hand on it and felt the faint residual warmth of bodies, of rifles, of impact. It was fading by the second. Around her, the team moved with quiet precision, their forms reduced to silhouettes. One marked grid coordinates on a wrist pad, another collected weapons, stacking them in silence for later recovery. They spoke little. The calm after battle wasn't relief. It was discipline's last expression. The understanding that order had to persist, even when the need for it seemed gone. A piece of brass rolled against her boot, catching the dim light. She knelt, picking it up between two fingers. The casing was smooth and cold, its burnished gold dulled by grit. For a heartbeat, it reflected the faintest glimmer of starlight, the last echo of the day's violence. Then she let it fall. The wind swept a thin layer of sand over it almost instantly. "Check the perimeter," she said softly, not because it was necessary, but because the words anchored her. The replies came like distant echoes, steady, subdued, human. She knew each of their voices by tone. Alone, fatigue, control, awareness. The sounds blended with the whisper of shifting dunes until they became part of the same slow rhythm. The desert had reclaimed them already. Mirage bands along the horizon shimmered, no longer deceptive but beautiful, reflections of light with nothing left to hide. Even the air tasted different now, metallic and cool, carrying the faint scent of brass buried under layers of sand. Megan turned east, scanning the pale ridgelines where moonrise began to seep through the haze. The light there was soft, almost white, painting the world in a fragile calm. Every dune seemed sculpted by the wind into something deliberate, something eternal. And yet, she knew. Give it one night, and not a single trace of their presence would remain. She walked toward the crest of a ridge, boots sinking into loose sand that hissed beneath her. At the top, she stopped and looked back. The basin lay empty now, a clean sweep of terrain untouched by what had unfolded. Even memory struggled to hold its shape against the sheer indifference of the place. Her heartbeat slowed as she exhaled, tasting salt and dust. The tension was gone, replaced by an almost painful clarity. In the silence, she understood that control wasn't about domination or victory. It was about carrying purpose through the aftermath, refusing to vanish with the chaos. "Megan," Ortiz said quietly from behind her. "Package secure." She nodded once. "Secure. We move south. Extraction in 20. The team began their withdrawal. Slow, deliberate, silent. They descended the ridge like shadows slipping back into the earth. The wind rose behind them, smoothing their trail in real time, a tide erasing its own path. Before she followed, Megan looked down one final time. The moon had risen fully now, silver light washing over the dunes, flattening them into a seamless plain. In that light, something glinted faintly near where she'd knelt, a single brass casing half buried, still catching its last reflection. She watched as the next gust of wind rolled over it, dust flowing like water. The glint dimmed, softened, disappeared. She raised her eyes to the horizon, now pale and luminous, and started walking. The sand shifted underfoot, whispering with each step, folding back into its rhythm. The night absorbed them completely. 6 figures fading into the silver desert, leaving behind nothing but the faint suggestion of discipline's passage, and the certainty that even silence, in its own way, remembers. Night had taken everything. The dunes were no longer gold but black glass, each curve silvered by starlight. The horizon had vanished completely. Sky and earth fused into a single dark plain. Only movement betrayed the boundary, the faint, restless flow of sand drifting across their boots, whispering over the remnants of battle. The desert no longer looked hostile. It was vast, quiet, and absolute, a witness that neither judged nor remembered. Megan stood on the ridge with her team spread in a wide semicircle below, their silhouettes small against the endless dark. The temperature had dropped fast, the air thin and metallic, the kind that made breath visible for a second before dissolving. She could feel the sting of it through the tears in her gloves, each fingertip raw where fabric had worn away. Grit clung to the braid trailing down her shoulder, stiff from salt and dust. Her helmet's edge caught faint glints of starlight as she scanned the basin one last time. Through her thermal scope, the world became an abstraction, heat ghosts shimmering faintly where life had been. Some signatures were fading fast, residual warmth from expended rounds, the faint outline of a body cooling into sand. Beyond that, nothing moved. Only the wind. Only the desert, reclaiming. Ortiz approached quietly, boots sinking with a soft crunch. All accounted for. Drone core ready for transfer. She nodded, but didn't lower the scope. Any trace? None. Even the casings are gone. She almost smiled. That was the desert's final act. Erasure, through elegance. Everything returned to balance eventually. Even chaos found its symmetry here. "Good," she said softly. "Then we hold until birds inbound." He stepped back, understanding. That meant silence. She watched the ridgelines again, the way light, or its absence, sculpted them. Shadows had no edges now, only gradients. Every line dissolved before it could define itself. It reminded her of the mirage before the ambush beauty layered over danger. Illusion, protecting truth. Except now, the illusion was peace. Her body felt heavy but steady. Fatigue had a weight different from fear, a deep pull inward, where motion slowed into control. Every muscle that had burned an hour ago now held its own quiet rhythm. She didn't feel victorious, only anchored. Proof that endurance was its own kind of faith. The team worked below, silhouettes moving with the slow grace of exhaustion. They weren't celebrating. They were cataloging, counting, confirming, making sure every detail of procedure remained intact. It wasn't habit, it was identity. The job never ended when the firing stopped. A gust of wind rose, carrying a thin veil of sand across the ridge. It stung her cheeks, settled in her collar, whispered against the metal of her rifle. She adjusted her stance, lowering the weapon slightly, its surface already coated with dust that shimmered faintly under the stars. Every grain felt like time itself, trying to bury them even before they'd left. She thought of the brass casing she'd seen earlier, swallowed by the sand, the perfect metaphor for their existence. Their actions left no monument, no record beyond the brief shimmer before disappearance. And yet, within that impermanence lay the meaning. Discipline wasn't about legacy, it was about presence, to act precisely in a world that erases itself. Her comms crackled faintly. Extraction inbound. ETA 2 mics. The sound was small, mundane, but it felt enormous against the silence. She turned south, scanning the sky until she caught the faint strobe of approach lights, distorted by distance. The desert seemed to inhale. The others gathered by instinct, forming a loose perimeter at the ridge's crest. No words, no formation call, just rhythm. Their outlines cut against the horizon like brush strokes in motion, human and ghost in equal measure. As the helicopter drew near, the low thump of rotors rolled across the dunes, deep and physical, shaking loose small avalanches of sand. The night that had been absolute was suddenly alive with vibration. A cone of wind spread outward, turning the desert into a storm of gold dust. The rotors caught the starlight and scattered it into fragments, a brief illusion of dawn in the middle of darkness. Megan's braid whipped across her shoulder, lashing against her plate carrier. The rifle hung low in her hands, barrel down, strap taut across her chest. Her gloves, torn, blackened, and slick with dried blood, gripped the weapon with the same steady purpose as before. She stepped forward into the rotor wash. Sand lashed her faceplate, wind roaring around her, but her stance didn't waver. Behind her, the team followed, their shadows dissolving in the dust storm the bird created. Through the roar, the extraction crew's light blinked, the signal for embark. Megan gave one last look at the horizon, where the dunes rolled endlessly into nothing. Under the starlight, they looked almost alive, their surfaces rippling as if the earth itself was breathing. She raised her scope one final time, sweeping the far distance. Faint heat mirages pulsed and vanished, no movement, only memory. The world was clear. She exhaled slowly, lowering the scope. Foothold secured, she said into comms, her tone flat but final, eyes forward. Her boots pressed into the sand, leaving the last visible prints before the next gust erased them. The helicopter's downwash turned the air to gold, swirling grains rising around her like a halo of dust and memory. As she reached for the boarding handle, her torn glove caught the steel, and for an instant she saw its reflection, fabric frayed, blood dried, grit embedded in every seam, control and cost, endurance and erosion, held together in that single image. She climbed aboard, the wind howling behind her. The last thing she saw as the ramp lifted was the ridge, already fading back into silence, already clean, already gone. Above the desert, the aircraft banked south, its lights blending into the stars. Below, the dunes shifted again, whispering over what had been. The The night closed around them, quiet, infinite, complete, and the desert kept its promise to forget everything except the discipline that survived it.